So this particular flow chart sort of talks through this process that I had talked through on this slide. And you'll be seeing this flow chart kind of again and again in chapters. It starts in chapter 5, but you will see it again in chapters 6 and 7. This is essentially a talking through the steps of how you determine for each process and generally if you're going to rely on test of controls versus use substantive procedures. This first step is saying, first, during my risk assessment procedures, I look to see if internal controls are effective or if I think they're going to be effective. So this is the step where you're assessing control risk, but before you've actually tested controls. And up at this step, you're supposed to decide, hey, am I planning on testing controls? Do I think controls are effective? So what that means is if I think controls are effective, that kind of implies that I think control risk is low or at worst moderate. And if you think control risk is low or moderate, if you think controls are effective, that implies you are going with a reliance approach, which essentially means you are relying on test of controls. You're relying on effectiveness of controls, and that means you are going to do your test of controls here, and you'll be able to, like I was saying in this slide, you'll be able to do fewer substantive procedures over here. Now, let's say that you're in the opposite situation where controls are not effective. So this is going to be control risk is high. If that's the case, then you are going to go for a substantive approach, which means I'm not relying on test of controls. I am going with my substantive procedures. And that's sort of this path that it's showing here, where you're going straight down to substantive procedures. And it walks you through this idea here, these steps, that you'll do substantive analytical procedures first. And then if you think you need more work, you're going to do substantive test of details. I would say for most of my audits, substantive test of details were always necessary if we had determined an account was a significant account. The only time we really thought substantive test of details weren't necessary was if an account was a major balance sheet line item, but wasn't a significant account. So let's say I had an account like other current assets that had a very small balance, right? It's a balance sheet line item, but it has a very small balance underneath TM. So I don't technically consider it a significant account, but since it's a balance sheet line item and it's actually showing up, I still want to do some testing, then I might do some substantive analytical procedures, but not do the test of details. Anyway, going back to this discussion, that's basically this sort of decision tree that it's modeling, is that you go through this idea that we see if controls are effective, you want to rely on controls and do less substantive testing. If controls are not effective, you won't be able to rely on controls, and so you'll do more substantive testing. This is something we're going to be talking a lot more about in chapters 6 and 7, actually. So it says that after assessing potential effectiveness of internal controls, will test of controls will be conducted? The answer is always yes for a public company. That kind of flies in the face of what I just said, right? Because I said if they're not effective, you would not want to test controls and you'd go for the substantive approach. This is true for private companies, and it used to be true for public companies too, pre-SOX. Post-SOX, because we are required by 404 to give an opinion on internal controls over financial reporting, which we'll talk about more in chapters 6 and 7. Because we have to give an opinion on internal controls over financial reporting, we do have to test controls, even if we believe controls are not effective. So even if we think they're not effective, even if we believe controls are going to fail, we still have to go through the motions of testing controls and watching them fail and documenting their failure because we have to give that opinion. We will talk about that more here in chapter 6 and 7. And this slide is also illustrating the same thing, but in a different way. So we have sort of a few different visual illustrations of this concept. So this is one I really like. So it's basically showing the amount of audit procedures you have to do. Basically, it's saying, okay, you have to always do risk assessment procedures, right? You're always going to have to do some concluding procedures. So you always have to do this much risk assessment. I'm always going to have to do this much concluding procedures. But my TOC versus my substantive procedures is going to be a balance depending on the type of audit I'm doing. I could feasibly have audit A where control risk is high, right? Controls are bad, and detection risk is low, which means I'm doing lots of substantive work. I'm taking a substantive approach. In that case, I would be getting no evidence from test of controls, and all my audit evidence I'd be gathering here from substantive procedures. On the opposite end of the spectrum, I could have audit E, which would be low control risk, amazing controls. So I'm able to do less in terms of substantive procedures, right? The reliance approach I talked about. And in that case, I'm gaining all this audit evidence from my TOC. I still always have to do some substantive work though. So I want to be clear. You see down here on this end of the spectrum, I can do for a private company, I can do 0 test of controls and all substantive procedures, but I can't have the opposite case where it's all test of controls, right? Like this does not exist. You can't have all TOC and no substantive procedures. So even if controls are perfect, you're still going to have some substantive work to do at the end. And then you're going to have all these cases in the middle. So this could be your audit C, where they have, let's say some processes where controls are good, some processes where controls are bad. And so you have to do kind of a medium amount of substantive work, but you're getting a lot of evidence from test of controls too. Your book illustrates this with this assurance bucket analogy. Many of my students in the past struggle with this bucket analogy. So the idea behind the bucket is by the time I am at the end of my audit, in order to issue my audit opinion, my assurance bucket has to be full of water, aka audit evidence. And that audit evidence can be made up of a variety of things. So one would be my risk assessment procedures. Some of the evidence is going to come from test of controls. And some of the evidence is going to come from these two parts of the bucket, which are substantive testing, right? One is just analytical and one is test of details, but both are substantive testing. So the idea behind the bucket is, hey, I can have different amounts of water or evidence in the bucket coming from TOC versus substantive procedures, as long as at the end of the day, my bucket is full. So it kind of has this visual where it shows the buckets being filled by different amounts. Like for instance, with this one here, there seems to be more test of controls, and with this one, there's like very little from test of controls. So you kind of get the idea. So some of these are going to have less from the substantive tests, and some are going to be more full from the substantive tests. But at the end of the day, what you're going for is for each account and for each assertion within each account, you need a full bucket. And that's sort of what this one is showing. It's showing for AP, for each assertion within AP, you need a full bucket. And the buckets can be different sizes because for each individual assertion within each account, you're going to have different risks associated with that assertion. So for AP in particular, your big risk with AP is completeness. So that's why the completeness bucket is the biggest because completeness is the biggest risk for AP. You need to gather the most audit evidence for completeness. Just think through that for a minute. So for a for-profit company, we've talked about this idea before, that the big risk with assets is that they're going to be overstated, right? Asset and revenue accounts will most likely to be overstated, whereas liability and cost accounts or expense accounts are most likely to be understated. So this AP would be a liability account, therefore understatement is the big risk, therefore completeness is the assertion with the most risk associated with it, therefore completeness is where we need to gather our most amount of evidence. So coming here, if we now read this question, during the planning phase of the audit, the auditor initially assesses control risk to be moderate. After performing extensive control testing procedures, the auditor determines that internal controls are operating effectively. Auditor reassesses control risk and determines control risk is now low. Auditor can now, so take a pause and read this. So at first I thought control risk was moderate, so I thought control risk was higher, which meant my substantive testing would have been greater, more substantive work. But now, after the reassessment, control risk is lower, which means I get to do less substantive work. Hopefully you got a decreased substantive testing. And remember, what goes along with that, what's kind of unsaid in this question, is if they're assessing control risk lower, that means they think controls are effective and they are going to be doing more test of controls. Right? So they're going to be getting more evidence in their bucket, if you will, from test of controls than they formerly were. Right? In other words, they moved from here in the middle with control risk at moderate to here with control risk at low. So that's going to require less substantive work, but more TOC work.